we're looking at three aspects of Paul's mission ministry, sort of his self-identity, that he uses twice these three designations to describe who he is and what he's doing. And one of those is proclaimer of the gospel to people who've never heard. The second one as a teacher of these new believers who have to be trained in how to follow Christ. And then the third one is as an apostle of the church. He is a founder of these churches that he is writing. And so today we're looking at Paul the teacher. And this section, as we think about Paul the teacher, is divided into two larger sections. One that we're looking at right now is the methodology, which I find so amazing, and hope that you'll learn from it. And then we'll later, after we look at method, we'll look at the content, because we can see, it's written all the way through the New Testament, what Paul was actually teaching these churches. So we'll look briefly at both of those. Well, there is a problem here with fast discipleship, and let me explain that. In 1912, Roland Allen wrote Missionary Methods, St. Paul's or Ours. I've mentioned that before, I think. And in it, he emphasized the fact that in 10 years, Paul established churches all across 3 provinces, which is rather astonishing, really. And Allen was contrasting how missions was being done in China, in around the year 1900, which seemed very slow, and how Paul did it. And so this issue of being so fast is something that Allen emphasized and sort of said maybe we're missing it because we're not following this way. Now, since that time, there's been, both in Pauline studies, but especially in mission studies, I think there's been widespread concern that Roland Allen, and the implication is, and Paul himself, were not committed to deep discipleship. In fact, I've heard people say, well, if Paul was a really good teacher or whatever, he would stay much, much longer with these churches before he moved on. Let me just jump in and say this way, though. I think that is mostly pastors looking at Paul's ministry thinking that he's a pastor, and he's not. He is a pioneer church planting missionary, and he's still got more and more places to go and share with. He's establishing the foundation, and those churches continue to grow, and they continue to have pastors then after he was gone who stayed for maybe the rest of their lives and taught and taught and taught and deepened those people, which is what God's plan is. But Paul knew that that wasn't his plan. So when we compare Paul's methodology to, say, the pastor of a large church in America who stays in that church for 30 or even more years, and we now criticize Paul, I think we're comparing apples and oranges. Paul knew that he was not called to be the pastor who stayed a long time. So Paul knew that he could be forced to leave an area by his own experience, right? Over and over it happened. In fact, most of the time when Paul leaves a place pretty quickly, it's very evident that this was because he was forced to do so. He is boldly proclaiming the good news of Jesus. That's stirring up angry Jews in some cases, or angry non-Jews, pagan, Gentiles in other cases, and they get him run out of the city, or he's running for fear of his life or whatever. So Paul knew when he got there, man, he had to lay this foundation quickly because he didn't know how long he was going to be there. But here's another part of this. When you're working with people who are the first Christians in a place, and they're coming out of darkness, and they've never seen a believer, that new pattern of life has to be established very quickly. If it's not established quickly, then it's most likely after about 3 or 4 months that they're going to settle into this new pattern of life that's not yet very Christian, and that is their new norm of what it means to be a Christian. I think Paul could see that, as he had ministered in all of these Gentile areas where people coming out of Greek, mostly Greek paganism. And so what we see is Paul working very hard and quickly, and I'm going to describe that as decisive. This has to happen fast. Now, one of the issues that are going to come up a lot, especially for educated people and maybe mostly for Westerners, but no, this is actually a concept that's widely known around the world. In the fields of study of medicine and engineering, in education and politics and all these kinds of different fields of study, they will often use the project management triangle to train people how to think about how to develop something new in their field of study, whether it's medicine or education or whatever. And in this commonly used triangle, by the way, I learned this from another missionary colleague of mine who was brilliant, and he had been a nuclear engineer, and he said that this was on the wall in the office at their nuclear power plant. So the triangle has obviously 3 points. One is quick or speed, one is quality, and one is cheap or cost. And at the bottom of the poster it says pick any two. The assumption is you can't possibly have all three of these. You can't have something very quickly and cheaply that comes out to be very high quality. It just doesn't work that way in human planning. So the triangle then states that if you have to do something that's quick and cheap, you're going to have to compromise about quality. And we sort of see that in a lot of work, in different areas of life. Or if you are going to focus on saving money and having quality, then this is most likely going to develop very slowly. You may get the quality, you may not have to spend a lot of money, but it's certainly not going to be quick. Or if you decide that you have to have this very quickly and it has to be of the highest quality, the company's going to have to spend a lot of money on this. It's going to have to pull in other personnel, perhaps. It may have to pay people overtime. They may have to buy special equipment to get this done very quickly. So now this project is really expensive, maybe too expensive if you're really pushing both quick and quality. Now, the thing that throws us off about Paul is that, we're going to see that what he was doing was very good quality, but it was also quite fast. And that throws off our thinking because as materialistic Westerners, we mostly think of cost in terms of money. But that's not the real cost that's got to be paid here. So let's think about this decisive discipleship in the New Testament. And that's the model we're going to be looking at. So we know that Paul, Silas, and Timothy made disciples in the city of Thessalonica. And it certainly appears, and most scholars agree, that they were only there about 3 to 8 weeks. In fact, most scholars will say it was much less than 8 weeks, which is, again, rather shocking. They arrive in a city where there are no Christians, and after a short period of time, 3 to 8 weeks, they write back, and they are writing a church that shows all kinds of maturity. That's unthinkable to us, especially in our church environments where we don't function this way. We don't do decisive discipleship. So, again, almost the whole book of 1 Thessalonians is just affirming that they made quality disciples and that it happened very fast. But what we're going to see as we study this is that the progress came at great cost to the disciples, not in terms of money that they laid out. That would have ruined the whole thing. But in terms of cost of their investment in these people. So how did they make such quality disciples in such a short period of time? Well, let's think again this whole concept about Thessalonica and why I'm choosing Thessalonica. I do believe that Paul's ministry there is a great case study about the kind of methodology he used. How was he making these disciples, and where can we find the best description of that? Well, 1 Thessalonians gives us one of the best. And at this point, Paul wasn't new. Sometimes people see Paul do something in his earlier ministry and they say, well, Paul hadn't figured it out yet, so he's making all these mistakes. Usually that's because he's not doing it our way. I don't think Acts intends for us to think he's making mistakes. I think we should be learning from those too. But at this point in the story, he's been around a while. He's been doing this for a good period of time, and so we can just assume that Paul is a veteran missionary. He knows what he's doing. And unusually, Paul was in this city a relatively short time, perhaps 2 months or less. So this really points out that fact about it can happen quickly, even though many times Paul spends a longer period of time. I think even in cities like Antioch, Corinth, and Ephesus, where Paul spent several years, we also have to be reminded that that wasn't one First Baptist church. That was dozens, if not hundreds, of house churches that they're training leaders for. So it's not quite like he's the pastor over, all these believers every week. That's probably not likely. But in Thessalonica, he just wasn't there very long. And he writes this First Thessalonian letter to the church soon after leaving, and he had to leave unexpectedly. So their memories were fresh of this, and so was his. So he's talking to them about something that had really just happened a couple of months beforehand. So Paul was laying a foundation of discipleship, but he was concerned about the fact that they had to leave so quickly. He wasn't fully satisfied. He wanted to stay a little bit longer, but as the book testifies, they're actually doing better than he perhaps had feared. And he describes in fair detail in this particular book how he carried out his ministry as a reminder to the church. And again, I think in some ways, these, especially the first couple of chapters, there's more material here about here's what we were doing among you, and he's pointing out why this had worked so well. So also in this book, he points out some rather specific qualities that had happened to them, ways that they had changed. And so I would view these as signs of the kind of decisive discipleship. And the way that Paul talks about them, I would say that he is saying these things in satisfaction that the discipleship process has been successful. So the first thing, one of the first things, the most important basic things is that these people had had a religious conversion. When they met Paul a few months before, they had never heard the gospel. They were following their old traditional ways of idolatry. And they recognized their past religious life was futile for salvation, and they turned with joy to following Jesus. That is a very clear and decisive conversion. And he describes the understanding about Jesus that they had come to. Obviously, he had been preaching this. And so he says, yes, this is what you actually now have in your hearts as a conviction. They understood the uniqueness of Jesus as Messiah, Son of God, and Lord. And I think we should understand that as the initial evangelism, the proclamation of the gospel. But the way Paul talks about this here and other places, I think is also just the ongoing part of discipleship. We live a certain way because this is who we have belief in. Our faith is in this particular Jesus, and is very clearly consistent with the gospel. And These new believers, rather than hiding it and keeping it personally to themselves or just within their church, they are out talking about their faith, although still relatively new in Christ. And Paul actually states that their testimony, the word of their coming to faith and the word of what they believe, has spread even to other provinces. And again, we're talking about in just a few months. So they're being quite active in talking about Jesus to their neighbors and perhaps even to strangers coming through the city. That's a really great sign that their discipleship is real. And then in 1 Thessalonians 1:1, even though Paul had only been with these people maybe 6 weeks, okay, we could even say possibly 8, though I think most scholars would say it seems less than that. He writes to the church in Thessalonica. Well, that's sort of astonishing. We would normally think of it taking several years to go from being the original believers in a place to calling it and organizing it as a church. Paul recognizes them as the church of Thessalonica. So their faith is expressed in community. It's not just some personal thing or just in their home. This is a community of believers who've learned to relate to one another and to support one another and minister to one another. All of that's taking place quite quickly. So when I look at these, conversion, conviction, confession, and community, I believe those are a great standard for assessing discipleship even today, don't you? I mean, those 4 really strong signs of their faith in Jesus Christ. They have converted their loyalty from old gods and old religion to Jesus. They have a deep understanding of who He is, and it's a conviction. It drives who they are. They're confessing Him very broadly and boldly, it would appear. Remember, there's been some trouble in Thessalonica. They're still talking about Jesus. And they are bound together in a Christian community that supports each other and allows them to minister to one another with different giftings and all. That's pretty astonishing. And I would say that's at least as high of a standard of discipleship as I've ever seen when they were talking about people going through some kind of specific discipleship program or process. So I want to talk about the 10 factors that Paul is going to discuss in this one book. He's going to bring these things up. And I think he's bringing them up because he is, again, explaining how all of this took place in the time that they had together. So the first one is the cooperation of a team. Now, the fact is, Paul, Silas, and Timothy had gone to Thessalonica together. It wasn't just Paul. We call this Paul's letter, for instance. They very clearly state this is a letter from Paul, Silas, and Timothy, and I think we should take that at face value. They had worked as a team, and now they wrote back to that church as a team. Each one of them had individual as well as team ministry and influence in the lives of those people. And so that's how this worked. And as they described what happened just a few months before in Thessalonica, especially in chapters 1 and 2, it's amazing how many times they refer to this whole process in terms of first person plural. We did this, or our ministry was taking place in a certain way. And so I'm just going to read a couple of those here for you. 1 or 2 of this would have been clear, but oh my goodness, they're clearly stating this was the cooperation of a whole team of them. They were able to reach more people, and they were able to go deeper in discipleship because there were 3. We give thanks. Our gospel. We proved. The reception that we had with you. We never came with flattering speech, nor did we seek glory ourselves. We proved to be gentle among you. We were pleased to impart to you our labor and hardship. We proclaimed. We behaved. We were exhorting. We also thank God. We, brethren, having been taken away, and for we wanted to come to you. Now, what this shows us overwhelmingly is this is not Paul's ministry. This is the ministry of his team. And that is so significant for understanding how could he have, discipled so many people. Well, there were 3 of them doing it. And I think we should note that. This team of 3 worked in cooperation and coordination to disciple these new believers. Now, that means that they could disciple far more people as well as evangelize far more people. But it also means that a lot of those believers had the benefit of learning from perhaps all 3 of them, or at least 2 of them. That deepens their understanding. It broadens their perspective of what it means to follow Jesus. So this is actually more powerful than what we normally think of in America as this sort of an individualistic approach, one-on-one kind of thing, which I think, again, cross-culturally in missions, it's almost always better to have a team. I think it gets better. You can work faster, and you also go deeper. And then Paul talks a lot about the importance of his own prayers for them. As he states there, we give thanks to God always for all of you, making mention of you in our prayers. That's after the fact. Or he says, for what thanks can we render to God for you, in return for all the joy with which we rejoice before our God on your account, as we night and day keep praying most earnestly, that we might see your face and may complete what is lacking in your faith. So Paul does this a lot, we know, in his letters. He talks about what he's praying for people. And, I think if we're really honest, one of the greatest reasons that ministry doesn't thrive and expand and go deep into hearts is that we're simply not praying enough. Paul describes prayer as hard labor. We are laboring. That means like we're sweating. We're working so hard. And he states that he was praying constantly for these new believers. So he was praying for them while he was there, and he's continuing to do so. Paul sees this partnership with God in this, and so they are depending on God to be working in the hearts, in the lives, in the families, in the neighborhoods of these new believers. If we want to be more successful, if we want to see people transformed deeply, then we must focus on prayer as critical to making disciples.